So why is there so much bad research out there at the moment? And this is because there's huge incentive to put out bad research. So you might be a company.
So today's guest is Alex Edmans, who's a professor of finance at the London Business School. And Alex, you wrote a book recently called May Contain Lies: How Stories, Statistics, and Studies Exploit Our Biases and What We Can Do About It. And in this intro chapter, the first chapter of your book, you basically start out by telling a story about how you testified before the UK House of Commons about CEO pay. Apparently, there was a union representative that was testifying as well that claimed that companies with smaller pay gaps between the CEO and workers perform better. And then this person cited a study. You then reviewed the study and found that the actual final version said the complete opposite, that companies with bigger pay gaps actually performed better, and that the union used, it looked like a draft of this study from a couple of years prior. You then pointed out the error to this committee, in which case it was ignored. And their final report basically said that the pay gap, caused massive issues. And then this helped pass a new law requiring big companies to report CEO pay gaps in the UK. And then it looked like a couple years later in your book, you talk about how the committee launched a separate investigation claiming that research showed that CEOs might not have much impact on the company's success. And then they had like a footnote, I believe it was footnote 110. So then you looked at the footnote, and then the footnote was referencing your testimony, even though you said the complete opposite. It seems like, and then so of course your book, May Contain Lies, kind of talks about debunking some of the research techniques and things like that, how they exploit data. But it seems like a pretty interesting story that you're basically like misquoted numerous times in the UK's committee.
Yeah, so the first issue was not one of me being misquoted. It was somebody else being misquoted. So the trade union cited a study, even though the final version of the study found completely the opposite. So why is that interesting? We like to use phrases such as research shows that, a study finds that, evidence proves that, but you can always find a study to support whatever you want to support, even if the study actually found the opposite result. So if I wanted an excuse to drink lots of red wine, I'm sure I could find a study finding that red wine leads to longer life. And notice the issue here is not just cherry picking the study with the findings that you want. Even if the study has findings that you don't want, you could quote it as if it found the opposite, and then you just believe that nobody's going to be nerdy enough to look up the reference and find what the study actually showed. So we like to see a sentence, and if at the end of the sentence there's a footnote and a reference, we think it's the gospel truth. But sometimes you might actually be quoting a study by quoting something completely the opposite of the conclusions that they actually draw.
In 2018, you gave a TED Talk, which was entitled What to Trust in a Post-Truth World. And then, of course, your book came out in 2024, which seemed like it was kind of an extrapolation of this TED Talk. So what was kind of like the precipitous, when I was reading this book, I thought maybe your experience at the UK Commons maybe was the impetus for writing this book, and then the TED Talk. And then, of course, your TED Talk came out before COVID. And then we've had a lot of other, quote unquote, post-truth situations since this time in 2019.
Yeah, so it wasn't that one impetus. It's just generally just dealing with misinformation. So my day job is a professor of finance, but unusually for an academic, I like to interact a lot with practitioners. So these could be policymakers, they could be executives, they could be investors. And when I interact with them, I often will try to share the findings of research on how to invest money or how to run companies or how to pass laws. But what I found was that how people would respond to research depended on whether they liked the findings, not on the accuracy of research. And so I think this is a problem, because it means that we latch onto evidence based on its appeal, not its accuracy. So prompted by my multiple interactions with lots of practitioners about research, I wanted to highlight the dangers of confirmation bias. So why is it that people misrepresent research? It's not that they're bad people. It's not that they deliberately want to misinform people. It's that they have biases. I have my own biases. And if you have biases, then if you see something that supports your viewpoint, you lap it up uncritically. And if you see something which contradicts your viewpoint, you just don't want to hear it. I wanted to highlight the danger of these biases and also what we can practically do to address them.
In your book, you have a lot of stories. You talk about the myth of the 10,000 rule, which was popularized by Malcolm Gladwell's 2008 book called Outliers. You talk about the sleep expert and some of the data that he manipulated in the book. You talk about Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes. You talk about the Deepwater Horizon and the oil spill and how what kind of led to that incident. What was probably the most shocking, or for you, like the craziest story from researching this book that you were like, man, I just can't believe this? And of course, I mean, you had so many stories you could have chose from to put into your book.
Well, I think the most concerning stories are the ones that involve supposedly smart people. So you might think, well, smart people should be able to be discerning. And indeed, the listener might think, okay, this is a podcast about misinformation, but I know how to deal with information. Those are mistakes that other people make. People like the lady who drank fish tank cleaner because she thought it was a cure for coronavirus. Sensible people would not make those mistakes. But what was striking to me is that even really leading people who should know better do make these mistakes. So the investors in Theranos, which is Elizabeth Holmes' startup, they included some really big hitters like George Shultz, the former Secretary of State, and they made a career out of being discerning about separating out the great opportunities from the poor ones. But just because they love this story of this young visionary who dropped out of Stanford and is succeeding in a male-dominated world, they invested tons of money without even asking for evidence that the Theranos prototype actually works and is able to diagnose hundreds of diseases from one single prick of blood.
There's a famous book called How to Lie with Statistics, which was published in 1954. And I thought maybe your book was kind of a continuation of that, because it seemed like in addition to talking about the biases that we have, you have a playbook on how to actually kind of lie with research. Do you think that your book is a playbook on how to do it? Is it exposing it? I mean, I thought you had a lot of kind of humorous stories, and I like the way that you kind of set this book up.
Great. It's great that you mentioned that other book, Jesse, because I think this book is related to How to Lie with Statistics, but it goes further. So How to Lie with Statistics is a great book. It's about how people can misrepresent individual statistics. And therefore you might think, well, if I can be sure that the statistics are right, then I'm home and dry. But what I'm highlighting in my book is even if the statistics are 100% correct, the inferences that we make from those statistics can be misleading. Why? Because my book is not about individual statistics. It's about the relationship between statistics, the science of cause and effect. So let's give a practical example. So before I had my first child, I took a parenting course and they were stressing how you need to exclusively breastfeed your children because of apparently cast iron evidence that breastfeeding is good for child development. If you look at the statistics, you do find that breastfed babies have higher IQ than bottle-fed babies. There's nothing wrong with the statistic. Those statistics are there. It's as clear as day. But the question is, well, how do we interpret this? So a popular interpretation, which is actually the World Health Organization's interpretation, is that breastfeeding causes the better IQ. So breast milk has better nutritional content, or maybe the act of breastfeeding creates stronger bonds between mother and baby, and that causes the higher IQ. But the alternative explanation is that whether a baby is breastfed or bottle-fed is not random. It depends on other factors, alternative suspects. So breastfeeding is tough. It's hard to do without family support. So maybe the babies who were breastfed are the ones with a more supportive home environment. And it's that home environment, not the breast milk itself, which drives the higher IQ. And I think this is really important because if indeed it's the home environment that matters and not the breast milk itself, this has a huge implications for parents, because often mothers are told, you need to breastfeed, you are being a bad mother if you are asking your partner to share the feeding load by bottle feeding. There was a reader of my book who wrote me an email saying she was in tears when she read this part of my book. Why? Because she was told by her hospital, which is associated with one of the leading Ivy League universities in the US, you can only breastfeed, but she can't because she has had a double mastectomy because of breast cancer. And they said to her, you're on your own. Right, we don't recommend bottle feeding. We don't provide any resources for bottle feeding because the evidence is so clear you need to breastfeed, even though she physically cannot. And not only is that message something which is very harsh to give to a woman who physically can't do that, it's actually not backed up by the evidence. And so when she read the true evidence, she realized, no, she's not harming her to be born child, and what she was put through, being shamed by the hospital for bottle feeding when that's the only option, is actually unwarranted. So why am I going through this rather emotive example? This highlights that being correct with data and evidence is not just an academic concept about being just accurate and purist and theoretically correct. These things have huge implications for how we live our lives, how we tell others to live their lives. You should not be a hospital and shaming women against bottle feeding.
Right. And then you also mentioned in that chapter of the book how basically the parents also had a higher IQ to already start. So maybe the kids would already automatically be smarter with both parents having higher IQs. Maybe both parents have better jobs that allow them to have more money, to have people help with the kid. They can pump the milk, and then the staff can feed it to them. I mean, there's so many other factors. Like what you basically say, when that variable was corrected for, just eliminating that alone almost made breastfeeding and the increase in IQ almost negligible.
You're absolutely right, Jesse. And what you're highlighting is the possibility of alternative suspects. So let's use an analogy of a crime. If you're a prejudiced police officer, you might think, oh, I think this guy or this girl committed the crime. I just don't like the way they look. I just don't like how they interacted with me. And so every piece of evidence you might interpret as consistent with that suspect, even though it might point to lots of alternative suspects. But because of your confirmation bias, you're blind to those alternative explanations. And similarly, if you believe that breast milk has to be better, and that can be for good and innocent reasons, well, I thought it was better myself, which is why I myself came into this thinking we will breastfeed only our child. You might think, well, breast milk is natural. Clearly something natural is better than something man-made. We learned that natural flavorings are better than artificial flavorings. But if your bias and your hunch is too strong, then it might be that you're only believing in the explanation that breast milk must be behind the higher IQ when there's a whole host of alternative suspects. So what the book is trying to encourage is to open our mind to alternative explanations. And notice here that to do that, all you need is an open mind and common sense. So the reader might think, oh, this is a book about statistics. That's kind of boring. Or do I need a PhD in statistics to understand the book? Is it filled with equations? No, there's not a single equation in the book. All I'm doing is trying to encourage common sense. And this is something that we can do at all ages, even children. When you're a kid and you read a murder mystery, you learn that it's often not the most obvious suspect who end up committing the crime. And just like a kid learns to think about non-obvious explanations, this is something that I'm encouraging the reader to do when they encounter evidence in the data in their daily lives in things as fundamental as how to bring up our child.
I thought one of the more interesting stories from your book is when you have this female kind of investor, apparently famous investor, never mentioned the name, but basically she came to you, wanted you to do some research to basically show that companies that have, kind of more women in leadership positions perform better. So then you did some research, with, I believe it was 24 variables, and basically found that there was no evidence that the companies with female leadership performed any better. And then they went, hired another basically company to show that. And then you kind of discuss why that variable, how they were able to come with that information by manipulating it. But then it also comes to so many different things. Like, how do you define better? Is better by who makes more money? Is better by, does the stock go up or down? Is better by, are employees happier? I mean, just even that, how you define that also just kind of manipulates the outcome. But I thought that was a pretty interesting story.
Thank you, Jesse. So this is an example of cherry picking, but actually a slightly different example to what we opened the podcast with. So the example of the House of Commons was cherry picking a particular study. I want an excuse to drink red wine, so I will find a study that claims that. And even if all studies claim that red wine was bad, I might tell my wife, hey, I found a study that shows that red wine is good for longer life, and I'm just going to trust that she's not going to have the time to read it and see what it actually claims. But here, this is the issue of, if you're conducting a study, you can cherry pick the ingredients to cook up whatever result you want. So what do I mean by this? So let's say you want to prove that diversity improves financial performance, which everybody wants to be true. Right? I'm an ethnic minority myself. I'd love to believe that diversity is good for you. There's so many ways that you could define diversity. Right, there could be age diversity, there could be racial diversity, there could be a cognitive diversity, there could be gender diversity. And even if we were to look at only gender diversity, how do we measure whether a board is diverse? Is it one with 3 or more women, or 2 or more women, or 4 or more women? Or maybe we don't look at an absolute number, but a ratio. Does the board have to be more than a third women, or more than a quarter women? How do we measure financial performance? Can we look at stock returns? Can we look at profitability? Can we look at sales growth? And we can do this like 3 years or 2 years or 1 year. So if you just run the data in enough ways, you're almost certain to encounter one constellation of the parameters, which gives you the result that you want. And so this links to the going beyond how to lie with statistics that you referred to earlier. So even if the statistics that you are shown are 100% accurate, it could still be misleading because there could be hundreds of other tests that failed, but you're never shown them because they just don't support what the person wants to be true. And so why is this such a concern? Because we often think, well, the solution to misinformation is to fact check, to make sure that whatever facts are shown to the public are accurate. But even if what is shown to the public is accurate, it's actually what is not shown, which is where all the action lies. So even though the investor did not do anything literally wrong, because she ended up quoting only the study, which gave the results that she wanted to, based on very specific measures of diversity and performance, it was still misleading because she'd run tons of other studies which found no result at all, but then hid them from the public.
Since you're a professor of finance at the London School of Business, you wrote a textbook on economics. How did you kind of tie in what we're discussing now with finance? And also, I mean, it seems like you're a consultant. You do a lot of work with various corporations. I mean, you used to work as an investment banker in the U.S. when you were, living here. You went to MIT, et cetera. But what do businesses want you for? What do they consult with you? What's how do they use this information?
So the topics that I specifically work on in business are topics such as ESG, environmental, social and governance, and DEI, diversity, equity and inclusion. And those are topics where there are strong pre-existing beliefs as to what people want to be true. Like, people do want to believe that DEI pays off, that inclusive and fair companies are going to perform better. And people also want to believe that environmental and social and governance, that pays off. Ethical companies which treat the world well, which are respectful of the planet, of their people, they also outperform. And indeed, that was the topic of my first book, Grow the Pie, showing that being responsible to people and the planet is actually good for the business in the long term. But notice that it's not going to be true in all situations and all times. And even though I'm a proponent of both, I also want to show that these are not black and white issues. So just like I'm a proponent of exercise and healthy eating, this doesn't mean that we should exercise 4 hours a day and overtrain. There is a limit to how much exercise you should do. And even though I think healthy eating is good, I think it's fine to have a drink once in a while. You don't want to just be completely extreme and avoid any dessert or any drinks. And so that is the same position that I'm taking with DEI and ESG. So often if I'm working with boards or with investors, I want to highlight, yes, there's lots of advantages to this, but I also want to highlight, where do we draw the line? What are cases in which actually practical realities and commercial pressures actually might be dominating what might be idealistically better. So sometimes you might actually want to rein in your investment in ESG and DEI. Why? Because you need to make sure that the company is also delivering its returns and able to pay back its debt holders and may be able to pay back its suppliers.
I think it was interesting that when you're talking about kind of like DEI, you mentioned in the book how a lot of people kind of focus on the ethnicity. But there's a lot of different other diversities, right? You have diversity of age, diversity of gender, diversity of social economic class, diversity of location. And it seems like, at least in the US, there was so much focus on like just the race aspect of it. Like you could have, 30 people from 30 different ethnicities, all going to the same prep school, all growing up in the same city, all going to Harvard. I mean, that's not really any diversity on any measure except for maybe two, gender and say ethnicity.
And I think this is a really important observation. So when I highlight, I say, well, the evidence suggesting that gender and ethnic diversity does not clearly lead to outperformance. People might say, oh, I don't like that message. This guy must be racist or sexist. Let me try to cancel him. But no, because what I'm saying is diversity is absolutely a good thing, but diversity is far more than just gender and ethnicity. So if you measure diversity with only those variables, you basically reduce the totality, the complexity, the humanity of a person to their gender and ethnicity. You give the impression that if somebody is a white male, they could never add to the diversity of an organization, even though their background might be in humanities and everybody else's background is in finance, even though they might have grown up in a very different socioeconomic environment. They might have lived in lots of countries as a kid because their parents were expats. So what I'm highlighting here is, yes, we absolutely do want to have diversity, but what really matters is cognitive diversity, different ways of thinking, different perspectives, different approaches to solving problems. Maybe demographics is one rough proxy, because men do think differently from women. And if you're from a different race, you might have had a different lived experience. But there's so many other things which matter for a person's makeup that we want to have a broad approach rather than this reductive approach. And that's why, to me, it's not surprising that the reductive approach of looking at just gender and ethnicity does not lead to outperformance when you consider the best quality data.
In the book, you kind of mentioned that probably the vast majority of or a big chunk of research is probably just not done very well. And in today's day and age, I mean, we're just constantly bombarded, whether it's social media, the mainstream media, different newspapers. Now you got Substack, you got all these podcasts, and you kind of talk about how do you kind of comb through this data to determine what you should actually trust and what you shouldn't. I mean, how do you kind of comb through so much data, whether it's academic, from newspapers, from podcasts, etc.?
I think it's first to look at what the problem is before the solution. So I think just like in medicine, diagnosis precedes treatment. So why is there so much bad research out there at the moment? And this is because there's huge incentive to put out bad research. So you might be a company, and that company might put out research in order to improve its image. So let's take McKinsey, which their image has been tainted due to association with, say, Purdue Pharma. And therefore, they've released many studies claiming that diversity pays off, even though the evidence behind that is extremely weak. Why? It's a good way of laundering their image. So we should first see studies put out by companies as being PR exercises. They're not scientific studies, in the same way that we know that sometimes tobacco companies might put out lobbying research showing that tobacco is not harmful. We should view any research with the company with that in mind. They do research in order to improve their corporate image. But let's not say all companies are evil and all academics are brilliant, because academics are people too, and they are biased. Nowadays, if you're an academic and you put out research which people want to be true, you can become really famous. You can sell books, you can give high-priced keynote speeches. The ability to do this is much easier now in a tech world where you can sell your books all over the world, you can give webinars, and you can access a wide audience. And so this is why there have been people like Francesca Gino who have had their research called into question. It gives nice results that people want to be true when actually the data may have allegedly been doctored. So I think first we need to understand that all producers of research, maybe including me, we have incentives perhaps to give messages that people want to hear. And so if you see a message that you would like to be true, perhaps be even more skeptical about it because you wonder whether the person is giving that message because of its appeal rather than its accuracy. Because that's the first step. First look at, well, does that person have an incentive to say what they're saying? And then number two, after asking that, then you can do some simple checks. And I go through this in the book, and there's a nice checklist at the end in the appendix with some simple questions. I'm not going to go through every single question here, but just go to a couple. If they refer to a reference, actually look up that reference and see, do they say what people are quoting them for? If they are presenting data, a link between two things, we'll check, are there other ways that they could have measured that? So then you're linking diversity to performance. Are there other equally or even more plausible measures of performance? And if so, you might worry that they tried them and they didn't work, and they're only showing you the results that do work. And third and one final thing is, even if there is a strong, robust link between two things, ask, are there other explanations? If breastfed kids have higher IQ, is it breast milk that causes the higher IQ, or are there other explanations such as a more supportive home environment?
You didn't really touch on this in your book, but I imagine if you had an updated version, you would, and that is just with AI nowadays. You mentioned, like, you Google something and you get a result, maybe it links you to a study, whatever, or a website. You can go kind of check out the veracity of that. But now with you Google something and it just gives you an AI response, people are using AI. You have, hell, there was a lawyer that, basically had a case, took it to court, and all the citations that the AI used were all made up. None of them existed. And so I feel like now where people are even thinking like, oh, we have this, big technology, LLM, whether you're using ChatGPT or China's DeepSeek or Llama, whatever. And it seems like even now especially, we need to be even more vigilant of like, where are these sources from when AI is just making shit up?
I think this is really important because we might think, well, AI should be a solution to misinformation. Shouldn't AI, if it's good enough, just tell you what is correct and what's not correct? But what AI does is it just shows you what is already out there. And if what already is out there and highly popularized and is viral is something which is not true, but it's gone viral because people want it to be true, then AI could be wrong. For example, I asked AI recently, which studies show diverse teams do better? It answers, several studies show this, and it gives the McKinsey studies as number one in that list. And then I responded to AI saying, none of the papers you cited are published in scientific journals. Please give me rigorous papers. It says, apologies for the early oversight. Upon further review, I have identified several papers with a more nuanced understanding, which actually shows that diversity doesn't magically pay off, at least not when you reduce it to gender and ethnicity and make it too simple. My third response to them was, those papers show much more nuanced findings than the flimsy papers you initially cited. Does this mean your initial response was incorrect? ChatGPT replies, yes. My initial response was incomplete and misleading because it relied too much on corporate reports, which often oversell the benefits of diversity. The scientific evidence is far more nuanced. So what this highlights is that we need to be discerning even when dealing with ChatGPT. So had I just accepted the first response they gave me, which is the McKinsey report, I would have gone away thinking, oh, there's clear evidence showing that diversity, when you look at just gender and ethnicity, improves financial performance. Only when I was willing to ask it, well, are these papers published in top peer-reviewed scientific journals? It says, well, actually, no. If you look at the scientific evidence, it finds something quite different. So we can't just say, okay, let's leave it to ChatGPT. we need to know how to use ChatGPT, and that is in a way which is discerning. So ChatGPT, I think, is a useful tool, but just like any tool, it needs to be used correctly, just like any machine or any weapon. If it's used by the wrong people, can lead to some negative consequences.
You're talking about confirmation bias in the book. Basically, it gives you a response. But since you study this, you basically know it's incorrect. So you prompt it to, kind of reevaluate. But if you wanted that response, you would have never prompted it. And then if you didn't want that response, you would then just keep prompting it until you kind of got the response that you wanted based on how you kept prompting it.
That's entirely correct. And so I think this is why we need to be aware of our own biases. As if it says something, then just ask, well, where was this evidence published in scientific journals, or was this just done by a company for PR? So if I want an excuse to drink lots of red wine, I might ask it, does red wine lead to longer life? And if it says, yes, there's the study, it's in my interest to make sure that it is accurate. Otherwise, I might make a decision which ends up ultimately being bad for my health. So we need to make sure that we don't just accept the results that we want. We need to be as discerning about something we do like as something that we don't. And I think this is not an unreasonable thing to ask people. So people already know how to be discerning. So if I see a study shared on LinkedIn that people don't like the sound of, let's say diversity worsens performance, there is no shortage of questions, such as, is this correlation or is this causation? This is only one study. Or how do they truly measure diversity or performance? So we know how to poke holes in studies that we don't like. So all I'm encouraging you to do is to apply the same discernment to studies you do like. So I'm not asking the reader to grab a whole new toolkit. You don't all need to do PhDs in statistics, but you've already got the toolkit, but just apply this all the time, not just deploy it selectively. So one simple tip I have for the reader, just to think more critically, is whenever you see a study with a result that you do like, imagine it was the opposite result and see how you take it apart. So let's say we found a study showing that breastfed kids have lower IQ. We don't like that result because we like to think that breast milk, it's natural, it must be better. So we might say, well, there's alternative explanations. Maybe family background. Maybe the mothers who are bottle feeding are wealthier because they can afford formula. And maybe it's parental background which causes the higher IQ. So now that we've alerted ourselves to the possibility of alternative explanations, such as parental background, asked ourselves whether the same alternative explanations could be explaining the results, even though they're in the result direction that we do want to be true.
So today's guest is Alex Edmans, who's a professor of finance at the London Business School. He's the author of the book May Contain Lies. So Alex, two final questions for you. One, just where can people get a hold of you, find your book, that kind of information? Secondly, just leave us with a final thought related to this podcast or whatever is on your mind.
Well, thanks very much. So I am on X and LinkedIn and other social media platforms as Edmans. That's AEDMANS. And what I try to do on this platform is not just share my own work, but work by other people on topics that I think are of interest. And I also particularly like to share things which have a somewhat contrarian view. And this is not to be a conspiracy theorist or not to always be skeptical, but because I don't want to be an echo chamber just saying things that people already know. I like my posts to cause people to think differently, and hopefully they come away from seeing a post learning something that they didn't know before. And I think just one final thought is just keep open-minded. Like there's so much interesting information out there, so many things that you want to learn. When we had the Brexit debate in 2016 in the UK, I was a strong Remainer. I wanted to believe that anybody who was for Brexit was racist or xenophobic or just didn't understand basic economics. I went to Brexit talks and I realised that there were good arguments on the other side. Even if I did not agree with the conclusion, I could see the logic behind the arguments. And by engaging with these people and listening to what they had to say, I came away much more informed and more knowledgeable than I went in.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.